You've been in many situations, and many of those have been in remote communities where you've been part of the first response team. When the mainstream Australian reads about Aboriginal youth suicide in remote communities, it's hard to comprehend. Any suicide we know causes devastation, but in small remote communities amongst small family groups, try and explain just how it is when you get there, and more importantly, how are people dealing with it?
Well, sadly, many of these communities have accepted loss. Some people call it the norm. I actually call it a vast sea of grief and disordered thinking and internalized grief. Internalized grief, which is toxic, is the way I best put it. And they don't see it as the norm. They grieve and pain and suffer as any parent or sibling would at the loss of a loved one. And community suffers along with them, particularly the smaller a community, the more impacting the grief, because everybody knows everybody. Everybody's in proximity to everybody. This could be anyone else's child and maybe anyone else's child at some point in time. This could be and maybe anybody's parent, brother or sister, and so it goes, or whatever, or friend. And we're human beings, are sentient creatures, compassionate, psychosocial, and we go from positive selves to negative selves in a whim's notice. And a suicide takes us to that type of disordered thinking that takes us to a negative self and to the potential of other aberrants, and to not being able to get up each day and not wanting to go on. So they feel it painfully. And I've been to Ramaginning, I've been to Milingimbi, I've been to larger communities, the largest First Nations community in the territory, Maningrida, and that's a large one. It doesn't matter if the population's a more extensive one, a more populous one, such as Maningrida. The grief ripples through, and the whole community knows. And there isn't anyone that doesn't know when someone's being lost in a community. Unlike the city masses, where people are lost in translation and families are much more isolated. But communities grieve together, and even though you're thinking that you're grieving alongside, it compounds the pain, because there's a remembrance of the lost one each day in your life, even though others are trying to support this grief. But some of these communities are so impoverished, it breaks my heart when 8 out of 10 kids in the majority of the remote will never complete year 12, or in some communities no child has ever completed school, where some of these communities, despite beautiful country and bastion and firmament of love, they're hovels of human misery. They're degraded communities, denied equivalent infrastructure to other communities. I never forget one community, I won't identify it where, but it is in the Northern Territory, and the family was so impoverished. The hope that many families, that just about all families in Australia have in terms of our city masses, households, Australian households, this family had none. There were 40 people at the household, made up of 3 or 4 different households, living in the most impoverished circumstance in the shantytown existence. There was barely any furniture. We all sat on the floor for hours. I spent days with this community. It was one of the few that I could do very little for. There was one child that had been lost, was 15 years of age, and the other child, a cousin that had been lost, was 16 years of age, all within days. 2 cousins, female and male, 15 and 16, Paul. And the family didn't hold out hope that their children would get educated or they'd have meaningful activity in their life, or there was much more to do than just meander in each other's company for the rest of their days, and their children, similarly so, and the children that are unborn that will come. And unlike all the good work and the massive outcomes that I can actually secure, including housing and health supports and opportunity to education and so forth, and affirmative actions, for this family I could do nothing. And other than food vouchers and purchase orders from the general store and so forth, and I asked them, what is it that I can do? And this memory has never left me, and it's brought me to tears many times. It's never left me. And they were to repatriate the body from the one community, the bodies of 2 children, from the one community to the next community. And they asked me which was their place of origin where they wanted their children buried. And they asked me, when I asked them what more can I do, if at that other end they could have 2 mattresses, 2 single mattresses and 2 mozzie nets for the dignity of their children while they lay there waiting for their burial. And I've thought of that many times, and that's all I could do. Now, my project that I was with at the time, I didn't have the remit to fund that, but I funded that out of my pocket. I organised with the other community at the general store for the provision of 2 single mattresses and 2 Mosley nets, because that's the only dignity I could give them. That's the only thing I could do for that family, and that's the degradation that some of these people live in, and that's some of the Australia that most Australians don't know. And it's why I've actually stepped down from the National Indigenous Critical Response, because after 2.5 years of coordinating that service as a post-intervention service, I've now established the National Critical Response Trauma Recovery Project to actually work in suicide prevention, to reduce loss, to be able to outreach to individuals to do the trauma recovery and work with them to improve their life circumstance. But I remember them all, and the communities live what I remember. I remember, but they live what you and I remember from what has gone on around us. I remember a father who found his son hours after his suicide. This is in a regional community, very small regional community. The father laid his son down, Paul, and cradled his body through the night until the responders arrived in the morning. And I remember the distraught family of a young man who only a week before his suicide in a small community had run into a burning house and rescued a young mother and her baby. And in another larger community, I remember attending the funerals of 3 young people in the one community, 3 burials in 5 days, 3 graves in a row. And a week later, there was a 4th, and a week after that, a 5th, 5 graves in a row of youth unlived. So it's this what I carry with me. It's this what you live and hear every day. But for the communities, their experience of this firsthand, looking into each other's eyes, and is indescribably more so than anything that we can actually describe. So the impacts are traumatic, and it is internalized grief, whether it's individuated, whether it's collective grief of a community level, and it has an impact, and it brings people down. And what we've got to do is actually support people to go from the worst of selves to the most positive of selves, because on a good note, I can actually say that above the poverty line, and this goes the ways forward, that people aren't taking their lives for First Nations. And First Nations students who now make it to university and get that shot, whether through the mainstream pathways or through alternative pathways, university, and I worked in that sphere for a long while and helped quite a few through. And they were part of our highest graduate cohorts. But First Nations students, like their migrant brothers and sisters, and the children of migrant brothers and sisters who lived socioeconomic disadvantage when they came to this country, amongst the highest graduate cohorts, the most likely to succeed at university to graduate. First Nations children are alongside that. They've got a higher rate of student retention and to graduate than non-Indigenous brothers and sisters have. So, and that's a good news story, because it's about, the affirmative actions that we need to actually, that have dried up for far too many, but we need to live once again or whatever and prosper and get them to university, or get them to meaningful activity, or get them to employment, or get them to a positive self. And it takes people to be there for people to do all that.
Gerry, one final question. In amongst all of this grief, are community members and elders coming up with their thoughts and their ideas about what they need to be doing with help to change their surrounds, or to prevent, this massive loss of young life? I
think it's very tough for them, and I grieve for them. Many come up with various supports. They work around identity and healing and culture. They work around community activity. Some work very hard through mainstream services in their community to actually get kids into education and so on. But we know what an uphill battle all of that is. The real issue is that, are they being listened to? Are they being funded? Are they being resourced? Are they being supported? Or are they expected to do it without the remunerated buy-in? Or are they expected to do it as vulnerable community members who have difficult circumstance amongst their own families that are impoverished, and you've got vulnerable people supporting the vulnerable? The big statement that I just made about, are they being funded, are they being resourced, are they being listened to? That's why we need a national Office of Suicide Prevention. That's why we need systemic change. That's why we need a suicide prevention minister. That's why we need to authenticate the suicide prevention space. That's why we need to make sure money is available and that money hits the ground, and that we can measure with compelling narratives the outcomes, the lives saved, the people whose lives have been changed, and the ways forward. So in the end, people can come up with all sorts of ideas, but I see more so their hearts broken because the funding doesn't happen. The investment in community doesn't happen. And we've got to actually understand that poverty is a powerful intersect with suicide for all Australians. And we need to lift people out of poverty, but we do need to help community work its journey through that poverty to an improved life circumstance. And it will take a national focus to do that. If Ken Wyatt's fortunate enough to become the Indigenous Affairs Minister, maybe he'll make some difference. Who knows? But if he can be also the Suicide Prevention Minister, that will also intersect suicide with poverty, because the issues for First Nations people today, other than the changes in terms of voice and constitutional reforms and self-determining values, the greatest tragedy are those that the deficit discourse that there isn't enough of describes, that those living below the poverty line, more than 300,000 First Nations people below the poverty line, 120,000 living have been to prison. From those 300,000, 120,000 have been to prison, with 11,000 in prison right now. And all the suicides, just about, are of people living below the poverty line. And then there's all the other aberrants I don't need to tell your audience or yourself that plays out much pronounced below the poverty line. But it's destroying lives. We need affirmative actions for those from a triage-based approach, from a triaged vantage on a needs basis, for those most in need. A suicide prevention minister, be it Ken Wyatt or someone else, and a Indigenous Affairs Minister, Aboriginal Affairs Minister, First Nations Affairs Minister, someday I hope it's actually called, will be able to focus on. And yeah, brother, I don't know what more to say, but that's my experience, and my experience comes from actually that word itself, the experiential. 600 communities I've visited. I don't think there's another Australian that's gone to as many communities as I have, or I don't know any other Australian that has, of the 1,200 First Nations communities. And even though I work across suicide with all Australian families, and for me everybody's a brother and sister, the tragedy of First Nations is so pronounced that it's an abomination, moral and political, and we need to actually own it and respond to it. And only a suicide prevention minister can be made liable for it, and then therefore versed in it. And only a National Office of Suicide Prevention can core and anchor systemic change in the ways forward and authenticate what needs to be done. And if, lo and behold, we score a Royal Commission at long last, then maybe we'll save lives and reduce from the 3,000 and heading much worse than what is in future trends, and save hundreds and hundreds of lives that we can reach, and then keep on working at it and do as incrementally the UK has to reduce theirs, even though they've got a long way to go. And Australia has a long way to go, because poverty is on the increase, not on the decrease. And the accumulation of life stresses are on the increase, not on the decrease. And for First Nations people living below the poverty line, there's also a crushing poverty so pronounced for a significant proportion that it's third world akin. In the 12th biggest economy on the planet, and the nation now with the highest global median wages, Australia has the highest median wages of $191,000 US dollars, 191,000, and that's the average median wage in this country, But in the 12th biggest economy and the world's highest median wages, we have third world akin poverty. We have the greatest divide between those that are the haves and those that are the have-nots. And the suicides are the have-nots.